If you were shopping for a car in 1960s America, you were living in the absolute golden age of access. You could walk into a dealership, slap some cash on the barrel, and drive out in a 2-ton chrome-plated land yacht. We are talking about cars with massive V8 engines, tail fins sharp enough to slice a Thanksgiving turkey, and enough leg room in the back to host a small wedding reception. Across the pond, British guys in drafty brick sheds were hand-beating sheets of aluminum into gorgeous, sweeping sports cars that smelled like rich mahogany and expensive leather. But over in the Soviet Union, the central planners looked at all that decadent, flashy, capitalist luxury, scoffed loudly, and decided the working proletariat absolutely did not need cup holders, aerodynamics, or, quite frankly, legroom. What the people really needed was a car shaped exactly like a dumpling. They didn't want a status symbol. They needed a vehicle that could survive a Siberian winter, navigate rural dirt roads made entirely of mud craters, and be fixed on the side of the highway with nothing but a rusty wrench and a whole lot of colorful swearing. They pulled off the heavy iron top, and boom, the 1960 ZAZ-965 was born. But hey, before we completely dismantle the hilariously terrifying engineering of the Soviet Union's most famous rolling potato, do me a massive favor, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring the bell so you never miss another wild automotive story. It helps the channel out a ton, and unlike the car we are talking about today, I promise hitting that button won't suddenly trap you in a thick cloud of blue smoke or set your pants on fire. Now, nobody really calls this thing by its official, robotic-sounding factory name. If you grew up anywhere near Eastern Europe, you know it by its legendary street name, the Gorbaty, which literally translates to the humpback. And honestly, you do not need a degree from a fancy art school to figure out why. Just look at the thing. It looks like a Volkswagen Beetle that spent its entire childhood carrying a really heavy backpack. It has the aerodynamic properties of a pregnant potato. The shape is so aggressively bulbous and round that if you parked it next to a modern sports car, the sports car would probably offer it a maternity leave. The crazy part is, the story of the humpback begins with a little bit of what we will politely call unauthorized inspiration. Soviet engineers basically took a really long, hard look at the Italian Fiat 600. In fact, they looked at it so hard that the early blueprints of the ZAZ probably still had marinara sauce on them. But they couldn't just copy the Fiat outright. They had to Sovietize it. The Italian car was built for zipping around sun-drenched paved Roman streets while wearing loafers. The Soviet version had to be a borderline tank that could survive the apocalypse, so they beefed it up and made some bizarre changes. Let's start with how you actually get inside. The humpback features what car guys affectionately call suicide doors, meaning the hinges are at the back of the door instead of the front. If you accidentally pop one of these open while driving down the road, the wind instantly catches it and violently ejects you into the stratosphere. It was basically a 1960s ejector seat minus the parachute. But the designers didn't use them to be quirky or stylish. They used suicide doors because it was the only mathematical way a guy wearing a massive thick winter coat and giant snow boots could successfully wedge his body into the cabin without pulling a muscle. And I do mean wedge. The interior of the ZAZ-965 is what a desperate real estate agent would call intimate and cozy. Technically, the factory brochure claimed it was a 4-seater. That is legally true, provided those 4 people are professional circus contortionists, completely devoid of a skeletal structure, or just incredibly comfortable being intimately acquainted with their neighbor's left kneecap. But the real party trick of the humpback isn't the interior. It is what is hiding in the trunk. Just like a classic Porsche 911, the ZAZ-965 has its engine mounted all the way in the rear. Sadly, that is exactly where the comparisons to a Porsche begin and end forever. If you pop the back lid, you will find the beating heart of the beast, a 746 cubic centimeter air-cooled V4. I know, a V4 actually sounds pretty exotic, doesn't it? It sounds like something you would find in a high-end Italian racing motorcycle. Do not let the layout fool you. This engine produced a mind-bending, gravity-defying, absolute tidal wave of exactly 23 horsepower. You heard me right. 23. You could probably get better acceleration if you just tied two actual horses to the front bumper and dangled the carrot. The 0 to 60 time was not measured in seconds, it was measured in lunar cycles. When you floored the gas pedal, the car didn't actually accelerate, it just aggressively vibrated and loudly announced its intention to eventually move forward. Because the engine was air-cooled and sitting in the back, it had a terrible habit of overheating. To fix this, the engineers stamped little air intakes onto the sides of the rear fenders. People immediately started calling them ears. The problem was, the ears didn't actually catch enough wind. So driving a ZAZ in the middle of a hot summer was essentially a game of automotive Russian roulette. Would you make it to your destination, or would the engine just spontaneously melt into a puddle of slag? Nobody knew. It was part of the thrill. And the noise, due to a complete and utter lack of sound deadening, that little V4 sounded exactly like a kitchen blender full of loose silverware. You didn't talk to your passengers in a humpback. You couldn't. You just sat in deafening, vibrating silence, praying your dental fillings wouldn't shake loose before you got to the grocery store. Still, my absolute favorite quirk about the engine is how you had to start it on a cold day. Sure, the car had a starter motor, and sometimes it even felt like doing its job, but the engineers knew that car batteries go to sleep and die in sub-zero Soviet winters, so they included a backup plan. A giant manual starting crank. A heavy metal handle. You literally had to walk out into the freezing snow, walk to the back of the car, stick this metal rod through a tiny hole in the rear bumper, straight into the engine block, and crank it by hand like you were winding up a giant metal jack-in-the-box. It was a full-body workout. It was CrossFit decades before anyone even knew what a burpee was. And speaking of the freezing cold, we have to talk about the climate control. Since the engine was air-cooled, there was no hot liquid coolant to pipe into the cabin to keep the passengers warm. In a place where winters drop to 40 below zero, you absolutely need a heater. The engineer's solution to this problem was nothing short of absolute unhinged madness. They bolted an entirely separate, standalone gasoline-powered heater directly into the front of the cabin. Let that sink in for a second. To stay warm, you literally ignited an open-flame gasoline furnace practically in your passenger's lap. The exhaust for this little death heater was supposed to vent safely outside the car, but the rubber seals were roughly as effective as a screen door on a submarine. If you drove the car in the winter, you were treated to a delightful, intoxicating waft of pure carbon monoxide. Drivers would routinely commute for 20 minutes, park, step out of the car, and immediately pass out in a snowbank. The cold wasn't what got you. It was your own car actively trying to gas you to sleep. Yet, despite the homicidal heater, the blender noises, the complete lack of speed, and the suicide doors, the ZAZ-965 became an absolute folk hero. Why? Because you simply could not kill it. It had fully independent suspension using heavy-duty torsion bars that were originally designed for military equipment. The underbelly of the car was completely flat. There were no dangling exhaust pipes or low-hanging oil pans to snag on rocks or tree stumps. It was built like a metal sled. In the deep mud, snow, and unpaved bogs of the rural countryside, the Humpback was a secret off-road god. When fancy, heavy government sedans would sink into the mud up to their axles, the little ZAZ would just happily skim right over the top. And if by some miracle it did get stuck, the car only weighed about 1,400 pounds. Two guys who had eaten a hearty breakfast of sausage and borst could literally step out, grab the chrome bumpers, physically lift the car out of the rut, plop it onto dry land, and keep driving. Good luck doing that with your neighbor's Range Rover. It became a massive part of pop culture, mostly as the punchline to 1,000 street jokes. One famous joke asked, "Why does the Zaporozhets have a rear engine?" The punchline, so your hands stay warm while you push it. Another one asked, what's the difference between a humpback and a pregnant roller skate? The answer, absolutely nothing. It was incredibly cheap too. Buying one would set you back about 1,800 rubles, which at the time was exactly the price of 1,000 bottles of vodka. And yes, people absolutely used vodka as an actual economic metric back then. But beneath all the mockery and the jokes was a deep, genuine affection. For millions of regular people, the ZAZ-965 was their very first taste of freedom. It meant you didn't have to walk in the snow. You could take your family out to the country on the weekends. It proved that a car doesn't have to be fast, luxurious, or even remotely safe to be legendary. Sometimes greatness comes from pure, stubborn resilience. The Gorbaty was designed to take the absolute worst conditions humanity and nature could throw at it, and it just kept